What's a company that's viewed pretty positively today, but has a dark, dark history? Story 1. Chiquita was originally the United Fruit Company. It has been a while, so some of the details are a little fuzzy. From what I remember Guatemala was developing its railroad so they could get goods to ports for export. Well, they ran out of money and couldn't expand. In steps in UFCO saying they will pay for the railroad as long as they can get exclusive use and an easement around the tracks. This gave UFCO the ability to use the infrastructure for free, railway and port. But Guatemalan citizens/government had to pay for its use. UFCO started using the easements around the tracks as banana plantations and would ship the product on the trains that were nearby. Everything was fine. UFCO created jobs and infrastructure for export as well as travel for tourists visiting. After a while, things turned south when the government decided that it didn't want to pay anymore and tried to take the land back. UFCO financed a military coup and took over every aspect of the Guatemalan government and was then referred to as the octopus since it had its hands in everything. They were also known for hiring militias to keep workers in line and would hurt or finish off anyone who complained about pay and conditions, tried to leave because they didn't want to work there anymore, or tried to unionize. After UFCO lost an antitrust suit is when Chiquita took over and kept doing. Story 2. Siemens is a global corporation that was involved in the Holocaust. They built the trains that transported Jews to the camps and were involved in a variety of industries supporting the Germans. They had over 200,000 workers at the height of the war and forced tens of thousands of workers to work against their will. Crazy how times change. Now they make trains for public transit and are a major player. Story 3. Wells Fargo, not sure they're entirely viewed positively today, but they've been full of crooks for years. Didn't Wells Fargo have that whole controversy like a year or two ago, where they opened alternate accounts under customers' names without informing those customers, just to have an excuse to charge more fees and inflate their profits? They also go around with your mortgage. I had a boss once who complained at least once every few months about how Wells Fargo penalized him for trying to pay more than the minimum monthly payment. God forbid you act responsibly and pay the debt off sooner. Wells Fargo set up a separate account to put the extra money into, to save for later in case he missed a future payment, instead of using it to pay off the debt and lower how much he had to pay in interest. Story 4. Boy, my time to shine has come. One December day in 2017, when I was between school and doing odd jobs, I was doing a sort of promotional thing for a company called Degussa. They're a German company who today specializes in gold and other precious metals. Essentially, me and the others occupied several positions in Zurich's main station to hand out chocolates and flyers to passers-by. Well, the day goes on, I go home and tell my dad about what I did today, as you do. He goes on to explain how that company was in the headlines shortly after World War II for manufacturing Zyklon B, the pesticide, used in the gas chambers of German concentration camps. They're viewed fairly okay, but this is a stain on their history. Story 5. Not a specific company, but an industry, Hollywood. During the late 1930s, Hollywood put a ban on anti-German propaganda in films since they had a big market in Europe and didn't want to step on toes. The notable exception was Warner Brothers. Jack and Harry Warner's family left Germany and came to America. The brothers saw the threat of fascism. They were the first studio to create anti-German content. Story 6. Microsoft under Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer paid staff to sabotage competitors' software. Later on, one of the first instances of this got named DOS isn't done until Lotus won't run. As an analogy, pretend Microsoft made and sold Michelin tires. It was like they paid people to go into parking lots and slash your car's tires if you had bought Bridgestone, Goodyear, Yokohama, or Pirelli. It did make Bill Gates one of the richest men in the world, though. Story 7. Hudson's Bay Company, or the Bay, has a pretty dark history, responsible for a lot of the early settlement of Canada and theft of native lands to fuel their beaver fur trade. They ravaged Aboriginal populations, stole their lands, and fought wars here, all in the name of trade. A lot of early North American colonization was done by HBC. There's a lot of information out there that details this time. Some of it is pretty difficult to read how they treated the Aboriginal people. Story 8. Union Carbide. Dark history, Hawk Mountain. It's been called America's worst industrial disaster. The construction of a 3-mile-long tunnel to carry the New River through Gauley Mountain in West Virginia. cost as many as 2,000 workers their lives. At least 764 of the 1,213 men who worked underground at Hawk's Nest for at least 2 months died within 5 years of the tunnel's completion, having contracted silicosis as the result of drilling through miles of rock to build a hydroelectric plant for Union Carbide, which owned the tunnel. Some 5,000 men worked on the project from March 1930 to December 1931, earning 25 cents an hour and working 60 hours a week. Many of the workers were African American and came to West Virginia to work on the project. As they began getting sick with what company doctors called tunnelitis, they were unable to return to their homes, and those who didn't die in their beds in the company-owned worker camps were driven out of town to die in nearby towns or were put on trains and sent home. Story 9. H&M is now recognized and beloved as a sustainable, eco-friendly company with great worker rights, but they used to be really corrupt and would use underpaid workers in third world countries who worked in horrible and dangerous conditions. They also used to use horrible, cheap materials that would cause massive pollution and wouldn't be able to be recycled. Oh, wait, they still do that. My bad, you guys. Story 10. Susan G. Komen. More people volunteer their time and money for it than any other breast cancer charity. I vaguely recall they kept almost half of the donations for themselves. They called it administration expenses. They've also been labeled with pinkwashing, defined as organizations getting disproportionate publicity for donating very little. Charity Navigator had rated them one of the worst charities for breast cancer. Bottom 10%. Story 11. I feel like it's known but not talked about. But Krupp pretty much played all sides in most major wars over the last few centuries. Then were extremely bold boys during World War II. Decided people had forgotten about that around 1951. They were right. And now they make pretty much everything that's big and steel. No, we can't lay the blame directly on all the companies that cooperated with the Germans, but we can sure point to Krupp and say, you made this possible. You used slaves to do it. And by the way, you fueled hundreds of years of arms races. You made it happen. Story 12. Not quite as dark as others, but Nintendo started out as a failing business. At the same time, everyone stopped making Hanafuda cards because they had become popular with the Yakuza. So Nintendo saw this as a perfect opportunity, and their cards were very popular with organized crime bosses. In the 60s and 70s, these cards were no longer quite as popular, and Nintendo tried all sorts of ventures. A taxi service, a disc-shaped remote control vacuum cleaner, their own brand of Lego-like bricks. One of these was a love hotel, essentially a hotel where one would arrange a meeting with a woman. They eventually settled on video games. Story 13. Andrew Carnegie is known as a philanthropist, due mostly to the 2,509 free libraries he built around the world. His generosity was in part an attempt to redeem himself after he sent in 300 Pinkerton, then convinced the Pennsylvania governor to supply 8,000 militiamen to break the Homestead strike. 16 men were ended, countless severely injured, and the Union was quashed. Andrew Carnegie promptly lengthened the workday and further cut the steelworkers' wages. Story 14. ABN AMRO, in the NL, is currently just another boring bank, but it has a bit of a dodgy history. The main legal ancestor of this bank is the NHM. The NHM was the main trading company, monopolist in the 1800s in Dutch East India, Indonesia. The Indonesians were forced to use a fifth of their land for whatever crop the NL authorities deemed necessary. The NHM transported and sold these crops and made a profit this way. Several other partly Dutch companies have a dark past through a Dutch ancestor company exploiting Indonesia. Story 15. Oneida. Today it is a company that mainly manufactures and sells silverware, dinnerware, and cookware, but it actually started out as a Christian community founded by John Humphrey Noyes that eventually turned into nothing less than a cult that believed in the establishment of a kingdom of God on earth. Among the darker aspects of the cult was the practicing of pedophilia, eugenics, and incest. Noyes believed he could actually breed a superior specimen of humanity by having a child with his own niece. Story 16. Surprised nobody has mentioned the entire fashion and clothing industry yet. Literally every company that gets its fabrics made overseas in places like Vietnam, Bangladesh, and Cambodia These companies are taking advantage of workers in countries where people are desperate enough to work for pennies on the dollar. This also applies to a lot of the plastics and electronics industry. Story 17. Pretty much every company that has existed longer than 50 years has a dark past. That's just a simple statement, and not saying it's fine or reducing the bad deeds at all. It will continue because at the end of the day, capitalism requires some unsavory actions to scale in any market. The only way to succeed is to try to control as much of your supply chain as possible and to outperform your competitors either by taking advantage of their failures or by outpositioning them. Altruism works at a small scale, but longevity and growth ultimately requires selfishness. Story 18. Nestle. They think they're so healthy and friendly when they have child slaves picking chocolate for them, stealing local water from streams, ponds, or lakes, and selling it for a high price. And they refuse to acknowledge the sins they have brought upon humanity. And they're like the Disney of foods. They buy and buy and buy so that there is no way to avoid them. I swear it's a conspiracy that they know our efforts of avoiding giving them any money miraculously. Bam! New product they've acquired that you didn't know was owned by them. Mark my words. If Jesus says Satan is prince of this world, then the CEO of Nestle is one of his many faces, if not the main face. Nestle is the kind of company that would go to Neptune or Europa to harvest the water from there. And even if there was life on those god-forsaken worlds, they wouldn't give two craps. Nestle deserves that hate that it gets, and if I had the power of God, I would use fire and brimstone from the sky or space to destroy each Nestle HQ, if not the main CEO. The world would be better off without Nestle and other companies like them. Good food, good life, more like Hail Satan, Hail Nestle hacks all of them. Story 19. Quite a few Austrian winemakers, actually. You see, Austrian wine is normally quite delectable. In fact, nowadays it's considered among the best. However, in the 70s and 80s, many of the winemakers were caught using a substance called diethylene glycol to artificially sweeten the wines. The catch is that diethylene glycol is very toxic, causing things such as renal failure, organ damage, liver failure, metabolic acidosis. Your blood becomes too acidic for the body, motor problems, brain damage, and in large enough quantities, death. And they were putting this crap in wine. Naturally, people freaked out upon reading in that day's morning newspaper that their wine could end them. One poor Saunoff drank so much tainted wine that he wound up nuking his liver. He lived, but it obviously wasn't fun for him. When the winemaker's executives were arrested, tried, and convicted, they blamed the vineyards, and by extension the grape farmers, for adding the substance, which was crap. Then they blamed the Austrian and German governments for crappy testing. Testing had been updated to be more efficient than ever following an anonymous tip, but lack of information around DEG meant the execs thought nobody would find out. Then, finally, they blamed the general public for drinking the poison wine. What? Just what? How was anyone else supposed to know the wine had been made toxic? To this day, absolutely none of the executives that were indicted and jailed take any responsibility for their actions. Nowadays, however, Austrian wine is considered some of the best in the world, thanks in no part due to the fact that the antifreeze wine had been dumped, and now it all goes through very strict testing before it can be shipped to the public. Story 20. When reading all this, it's tempting to think that the response should be to stop buying from these guilty corporations. But that presumes that a decades delayed marginal decrease in sales will be a meaningful deterrent to supporting or committing atrocities, and B, that the alternative corporations that you could buy from instead would have behaved differently in a similar situation. I think a much more meaningful response is to recognize that corporations are inherently amoral and that their power in society should be closely guarded. Story 21, McDonald's. It's not super duper dark, but what most people don't know is how it got to be popular. When it was owned by the two original brothers, it was considered innovative. The man who offered for them to expand was a failed investor who decided to take some last chance. It ended up working out, and the investor was able to buy the original McDonald brothers out of the business, and they received no recognition or financial benefits after. Also, the investor divorced his wife for a younger woman who'd been managing the locations. Story 22. The East India Company, as seen in Pirates of the Caribbean, is probably one of the most evil organizations in history, profiting from slave labor and committing atrocities across the whole globe, not least the Opium Wars. The Opium Wars simply consisted of conflict between Britain and China, whereby Britain was forcing Chinese people to grow opium for them and then sell it across Europe, Asia, and China as well. The problem became so great that China fought a war against Britain unsuccessfully. Britain won and made a crap ton of money from the opium trade. They made so much money that they had to have a bank based in China in order to circulate the money around and also fund the trade. So the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation was set up, otherwise known as HSBC. Story 23. Subway. During the 2000s, America was faced with an obesity problem from fast food's popularity. Subway realized that the crisis had a silver lining. Subway's products are much more healthier than most fast food retailers. They decided to have a new public face, Jared Fogle. In the ads, they showed Jared's Fogle weight loss, which was a remarkable difference. They claimed the weight loss was because of Subway. After that, the company blew up in popularity with Subways on every street corner. It lasted fine for a few years until Jared Fogle, the public face of Subway, was arrested for committing a crime. The whole company crashed and its future looked dim, however, they still managed to keep it up. Story 24. Crunchyroll, one of the largest Western streaming distributors of anime, started as a piracy site hosting other fans' subbed works. Even among anime fans that were fine with pirating and fan subbing, Crunchyroll wasn't viewed in the most positive light because they were making a profit off of other fan subbers' work. Even after they started acquiring legal licenses to distribute anime, they still hosted illegal content for a short period of time. They've since cleaned up their act and were just bought out by Sony, Funimation, for $1.2 billion. Story 25. Ratio Farm in Germany has been widely known to have profited from human experiments. Even weirder is that they use twins in all their marketing, and we all know they tested heavily on twins during the Second World War. Lufthansa profited from slave labor, so they aren't allowed to build aircraft anymore, just commercial flights. BMW built most of the engines for the bombers in the Second World War. Their logo is actually two white propellers in the blue sky. They are also forbidden to make aircraft, so they switched to cars. Story 26. PepsiCo. I'm a fan of Pepsi. I prefer all of their variations over Coke, so I'm saying this as a fan. But they had an opportunity in the 90s to save an entire country, and they chose to destroy one instead. This video explains what happened best. Pepsi ran a contest in the 90s in the Philippines where bottle caps had numbers on them, and every week a number would be selected, and everyone with that bottle cap became instant millionaires. Obviously, the contest is set so that only a small number of caps are considered winners. But somebody messed up. Big time. They selected the most commonly used bottle cap number as the winner. Millions of people thought they were millionaires. It caused riots and even death. Pepsi had the money and the opportunity to make all those people millionaires. In USD, a million Philippine pesos was around $8,000. But they chose to instead abandon the country entirely and pretend it never happened. To this day, Pepsi is a hated company by Filipinos. Rightfully so, if you ask me. Story 27. It's not exactly history, but anything Musk touches is viewed as the greatest thing ever, even though it's pretty crap, objectively speaking. Tesla is among the brands with the most flaws that require repair in new vehicles, and the cars are rated among the most dangerous repeatedly. That's because not only is the car itself completely crap at protecting you ice, but also because it has features, like putting controls of things like wipers or blinkers behind a touchscreen software, which is not only bad because it takes time and distracts the driver, but there's a reason that having safety features not be directly electrically controlled is a no-go. And that reason is that software control means they're affected in case the software has an error. Imagine your wipers not working during heavy rain because there's a bug in the GPS. The boring company literally makes a far less efficient, much more expensive, much slower subway. Not to mention things like working conditions, child labor, and throwing out anyone who dares criticize the company and cracking down on unions. Or the fact that the building process on the new factory in Germany has been halted multiple times now because Musk's approach to things like taxes, procedures, or public interests is to ignore them, which might work in the US but gets you shut down in Germany. Story 28. I'd say Autism Speaks. They're a group fundraising company that say their funds go to helping autism. Despite their name, only a small percentage of their funds actually go to helping people on the autism spectrum. They also made an old documentary in the 80s or 90s that mentioned a mother wanting to drive her and her autistic child off of a cliff, as well as funded a doctor who would often try to cure autism with electroshock therapy, and ended many lives because of it. And the good image Autism Speaks gave him was causing him to be able to get away. And I'm pretty sure he only served around 20 years in prison once he was caught, but would often be friends with the judge or bribe them into letting him leave as an innocent. Not only this, they also made a handbook you could buy from them that stated that the kid who had autism was to blame for the stress of the parent, and that autism could be cured completely. Which it can't, it can be helped, but not cured completely. And to add on to this, as of 2020, I'm not sure if they have had any recently, no one working at Autism Speaks has autism, and there are cases of old workers with autism there saying they were fired or quit because of not enjoying the company's ways of handling and helping autism in children. Story 29. Disney. Walt Disney was a supporter of Germans. While Disney was an innovative and successful man, he was also the subject of many controversies, most of which involved rumors that he was anti-Semitic and racist. These rumors were, and still are, hard to dispel. In the 1930s, Disney attended meetings of a pro-German organization, the German-American Bund. He also hosted a known German propagandist and filmmaker, Leni Riefenstahl, and gave her a tour of Disney studios. To make matters worse, Disney was also accused of perpetuating black stereotypes in his films. But for all of his critics, Disney also had scores of supporters who claimed he was far from being either anti-Semitic or racist. The debate on Disney's alleged discrimination and racism continues to this day. Story 30. Coca-Cola was originally made by a former Confederate colonel after the American Civil War. Due to his injuries, he had become addicted to morphine and created a cocaine-infused wine to wean himself off morphine. The recipe was later altered when a temperance movement grew in Georgia, and the intoxicating elements of the wine were removed, which became a non-alcoholic drink. Story 31. The Bronx Zoo had an exhibit with Ota Benga, an African pygmy caged with a chimp on display to demonstrate the Ape Man. This was in line with P.T. Barnum and Bailey Circus and Museum of Natural History, racist ideals of pseudoscience, from Darwin claiming all humans evolved from apes. That Africans, along with other indigenous people from around the world, were the missing link closest to animal species, and that ironically whites were a higher form of humans. These institutions also supported eugenics, the idiotic idea of natural selection, which was later adopted by Hitler, when trying to build the master race. Center for Disease Control CDC, support of the Tuskegee and Honduran syphilis experiments. Story 32. Apple sold blue boxes to the mafia, allowing them to make anonymous calls and burn all the evidence. One guy was cooked alive. The cops were tipped off and approaching. He pushed the button. He turned around to find that the phone booth door had jammed. Thermite made it too hot to approach, even if the cops didn't worry about it exploding. The phone booth melted on top of him, and he lived for a few hours in the ER.